February 18, 1943. RAF Marham, Norfolk. The smell of oil and fear hung in the air. Mechanics moved through the freezing hangars, their breath visible under the yellow haze of floodlights. Each returning de Havilland Mosquito was a contradiction. An aircraft famed for its speed and beauty, yet now returning riddled with shrapnel holes and burn marks from searchlights that had found it in the night. Standing near the wing of one damaged Mosquito PRW, a young Scottish mechanic named Sergeant Arthur McKenzie wiped his hands on a rag and stared at the polished fuselage. Something about its gleaming surface disturbed him. He had seen too many of them come back barely holding together, or not come back at all. The Mosquito was supposed to be invisible to radar, a miracle of wartime engineering built almost entirely of wood. But the German guns told another story. Over the industrial heart of the Ruhr, radar-controlled flak batteries were now finding their targets too easily. Night after night, reconnaissance aircraft were being shredded mid-air despite flying at top speed, often over 600 kilometers per hour. Mackenzie's eyes followed the beam of a searchlight crawling across the hangar roof. The light danced off the varnish of the Mosquito's skin, bright, almost mirror-like. He thought, if it catches light that way, what else might it catch? Before we continue with this remarkable account of wartime ingenuity, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of innovation and survival. And tell us in the comments which forgotten World War II invention fascinates you most. Now back to Mackenzie's dimly lit hangar, where he was about to break every maintenance rule in the book. Mackenzie was 27 years old, a carpenter by trade before the war, drafted into the Royal Air Force as an aircraft mechanic. He had joined No. 544 Squadron, tasked with maintaining the photo reconnaissance variants of the Mosquito, unarmed aircraft that relied entirely on speed and altitude for survival. He knew their construction intimately. Spruce, birch plywood, and balsa laminated together with casein glue. Lightweight, silent, deadly fast. But he also knew their weakness: metal fasteners, radio aerials, and that thick coat of clear lacquer used to seal the wood against moisture. That lacquer, he believed, was betraying them. It reflected radar like glass. In theory, the Mosquito's organic structure should have scattered enemy radio waves. But Mackenzie had noticed a disturbing pattern. When planes returned from missions with scuffed or dulled surfaces, they had often escaped undetected. Those with newly polished coatings, perfectly serviced by the book, were the ones lost to flak corridors. In February 1943, RAF intelligence began receiving intercepts confirming his suspicion. German radar operators were successfully locking onto Mosquitoes using Würzburg D tracking systems operating near 560 MHz. At that frequency, even a slight surface reflection could betray an aircraft's position. Inside the hangars, the mood had changed. Mechanics worked in silence, haunted by the sight of burnt fuselage frames being dragged off lorries at dawn. The wooden aircraft, once nicknamed the Wooden Wonder, now carried another name among crews: the Flying Coffin. Every evening, Mackenzie took notes in the margins of his maintenance logs. He wrote about surface sheen, reflection angles, and the possibility that a matte finish may absorb radio returns. To the others, it was obsessive. To him, it was the beginning of a dangerous idea. RAF Bomber Command was not interested in new theories. The technical manuals were explicit. Do not alter factory-applied finishes or doping compounds under any circumstance. The lacquer recipe had been approved by de Havilland's engineers after extensive wind tunnel and weather testing. Any modification could jeopardize durability or airflow. In wartime, procedure was survival. But for Mackenzie, the manuals had become part of the problem. He had no authority, no laboratory, and no right to question the science. But he couldn't ignore what he saw. The hangar around him was a symphony of tools and engines, spanners clanging on concrete, fuel pumps coughing to life, the steady pulse of test-running Merlin engines. The air reeked of acetone, oil, and fear. Every noise reminded him of another failure, another mission that didn't return. He began talking quietly with other mechanics. "You ever notice?" he asked one night. How the dull panels don't seem to catch the searchlights? Most nodded but shrugged. Nobody wanted to question RAF procedures. Doing so meant paperwork, maybe suspension. But a few young fitters listened. Among them was Corporal Raymond Ray Ellis, an electrical specialist. Ellis had once worked in the signals section and mentioned something McKenzie didn't forget. Graphite powder, used for grounding radio circuits, could absorb stray currents and electromagnetic energy. That single remark lit a spark. By late February, McKenzie's frustration had grown into quiet defiance. His shift supervisor, Flight Sergeant Turner, told him bluntly to keep your nose in the manuals. But Turner had also lost 2 close friends over Essen that month. Everyone knew the odds were turning against them. The Mosquito had once been untouchable. German fighters like the Bf-110 couldn't match its speed, and flak predictors lagged too slowly. But the Luftwaffe's radar had evolved. The Freya early warning network could detect aircraft 100 kilometers out, feeding coordinates to Würzburg gun-laying radars. With searchlights slaved to radar control, Mosquito crews were now flying through intersecting cones of light. McKenzie decided that if command wouldn't fix the problem, he would. He began collecting small tins of surplus cellulose dope, the clear lacquer used for sealing the wood, and started experimenting during night shifts. Into one tin, he mixed a handful of graphite powder borrowed from the signals section. The result was a dull gray-black fluid with a metallic shimmer. He brushed a small patch under the tailplane of one grounded Mosquito and left it to dry. The next morning, he tested its surface with a simple trick, shining a torch at it from an angle. The reflection disappeared. Under the same beam, the untouched varnish nearby flashed brightly. He stared at the contrast. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Word of his experiment spread quietly through the maintenance crew. Some thought it clever, others thought he'd gone mad. McKenzie had crossed a line. Altering the finish meant technically damaging a government aircraft. He could be charged under RAF regulations for willful modification without authorization. But the losses continued. Between February 5th and 20th, Bomber Command recorded 12 Mosquitoes shot down over Germany. The invisible aircraft was clearly visible enough. The officers talked about new flight paths and decoy tactics. McKenzie talked about coatings, when his section leader laughed, saying, "You think you can outsmart radar with paint?" McKenzie replied only, "Maybe it's not about radar. Maybe it's about reflection." That remark would soon echo through the entire squadron. Each night, as the wind howled across the airfield and the twin Merlins screamed through engine tests, McKenzie refined his idea. He sanded down test panels, brushed on new layers of his darkened varnish, and noted how each surface behaved under light. He didn't know it yet, but he was building the world's first radar-absorbent coating. The hangar lights reflected less and less from his experiments. What began as frustration was turning into quiet conviction. Still, he was alone. His colleagues feared getting caught. The official doctrine was simple: follow the book. McKenzie had already thrown the book away. By the first week of March 1943, he decided to act. He selected one aircraft, Mosquito PR.I, serial number DZ637, a reconnaissance plane due for a minor servicing check. Late that night, after the others left, he opened a tin of his graphite dope and began painting the fuselage sides and leading edges. The surface dulled instantly under his brush. He worked for hours under a single lamp, the mixture releasing a sharp chemical odor that stung the eyes. By dawn, the aircraft gleamed no more. It absorbed the light. McKenzie stood back, hands blackened, heart pounding. The plane looked dead, like a shadow. Nobody noticed the change the next day. The modification was subtle, invisible unless under strong light. Only McKenzie knew what he had done. Only he knew what he hoped it could do. The smell of oil and lacquer still filled the air, but something else had changed. A sense that the war, or at least this tiny part of it, might now depend on one forbidden layer of paint. What no one expected was that one man's impossible idea would work. The innovation began months earlier, born out of frustration and necessity. In early 1943, Allied intelligence confirmed that German radar was advancing faster than expected. The Freya early warning network, stretching along the European coast, could now detect aircraft at more than 100 kilometers. Behind it, the Würzburg D gun-laying radars had been upgraded for tighter tracking accuracy, using new signal amplification valves and rotating parabolic dishes. The Mosquito's once vaunted invisibility was failing. Its wooden structure, once thought immune to radar, was betraying faint but deadly echoes that guided German flak directly onto its path. At RAF Marham, Sergeant Arthur McKenzie began a quiet study of wreckage. Every time a Mosquito failed to return, fragments were delivered to the maintenance yard for inspection. He would run his gloved hands along the splintered wood, examining the coatings, touching where the lacquer had blistered from heat. Under a lamp, he saw what he believed to be the truth. Even wood, when polished and sealed, reflected radar waves. The glossy varnish acted like a glass surface, hard, reflective, and bright to a radar pulse. When he raised this theory during a briefing, the room fell silent. The squadron engineering officer dismissed it as nonsense. In 1943, radar science was still new and secretive. Only a handful of British physicists at Malvern's Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, truly understood it. Mechanics were meant to repair aircraft, not debate electromagnetic theory. McKenzie, however, refused to let go. He spent his nights sketching diagrams on scrap paper, showing how a radar wave might scatter when it struck a matte surface. His handwriting filled with numbers, wavelengths, reflection angles, conductivity values guessed from experience. He had no access to textbooks, only fragments of hearsay from signals technicians, and an old physics pamphlet he'd borrowed from the base library. What changed everything was a captured German leaflet, circulated among maintenance crews for intelligence training. The document, translated and marked restricted, described experiments on reflections from dielectric materials, the kind of surfaces that weren't metallic but could still bounce radio waves. Reading that, McKenzie felt vindicated. If the Germans were studying it, then it was real. He underlined a single phrase in the margin: gloss surfaces amplify return. The next night, he stayed late in the hangar, staring at a Mosquito wing panel under a work lamp. The light's glare danced off the varnish like a mirror. "There it is," he murmured. "We're lighting ourselves up for their radar." Mackenzie's motivation came not from theory but loss. Between January and February 1943, 3 reconnaissance crews from his maintenance rotation had failed to return. He remembered their laughter before takeoff, the casual confidence in the Mosquito's speed. Each time the radio fell silent, he took it personally. "If the brass won't change it," he told Ellis, his fellow mechanic, "then I will." Ellis warned him quietly, "You'll be court-martialed if they catch you." McKenzie nodded. "Maybe, but better me than another crew." He began searching for materials that could alter the surface finish without weakening the structure. In the signals stores, he found small tins of graphite powder used for lubricating electrical contacts and grounding circuits. Graphite, he knew, was carbon, conductive, stable, and fine enough to mix into dope varnish. He also knew carbon absorbed heat and certain electromagnetic energy. It was a leap of intuition, not science, but it made sense. His tools were simple: a hand whisk, paintbrushes, tins of cellulose dope, and a small drying oven used for curing plywood. The experiment would rely on proportion, not luck. He began by mixing 5 parts graphite powder to 1 part thinner, stirring until the metallic glimmer faded to a dull gray. He then diluted it further, aiming for a smooth, semi-matte consistency. The mixture dried evenly, forming a thin, conductive layer no thicker than a coat of paint. The first tests were crude. McKenzie coated spare wooden panels salvaged from damaged aircraft and brought them to a field radar truck operated by No. 109 Squadron, stationed nearby for calibration exercises. Posing as routine maintenance, he persuaded the radar crew to aim their set toward the panels positioned on a stand. When they switched on the Würzburg mobile unit, the scope showed a faint echo on the untreated panel, and a slightly weaker one on his graphite-coated sample. The difference was small, perhaps 15%, but it was real. The radar operator, unaware of the experiment's significance, simply shrugged and said, "Bit of a flicker, maybe interference." McKenzie made a note in his logbook. Echo reduced. Repeat test required. The following week, he tested again with thicker layers. Each time, the return signal diminished slightly. Word of his late-night tests reached his section officer, who warned him directly, "You're not here to play scientist, Mac. Stick to maintenance, or you'll lose your stripes." But by then, the idea had grown beyond control. Every mosquito that rolled into the hangars seemed to confirm his theory. Under the lamplight, their surfaces gleamed like mirrors. The cellulose lacquer, though waterproof, created a dielectric barrier, one that turned the entire fuselage into a reflective shell. In radar terms, it behaved less like wood and more like a composite conductor. McKenzie reasoned that a thin conductive surface, properly grounded, might instead absorb the energy instead of reflecting it. He had stumbled onto the primitive principles of radar absorbent material, RAM, a concept decades ahead of its time. His solution was elegant. Add a microscopic conductive layer that converted radar energy into heat across the surface rather than reflecting it back to the source. He didn't have the instruments to measure it, but his intuition was sound. The first real application came on Mosquito PR-Die DZ637, the same aircraft he had secretly coated days earlier. The matte finish appeared unremarkable, even unsightly to the untrained eye. But under a flashlight beam, it absorbed nearly all reflection. The effect was like painting a shadow onto the aircraft itself. Officially, none of it existed. The RAF Maintenance Manual, Section 8, Paragraph 14, was explicit. Unauthorized modification of surface coatings is prohibited under penalty of disciplinary action. Yet within the hangars, small acts of quiet rebellion had begun. A few mechanics, inspired by McKenzie's determination, mixed their own anti-glare compounds, usually with soot, boot polish, or engine carbon. None matched his precision, but the idea spread. The men joked about painting ghosts, unaware that the phrase would soon become literal. Above them, official radar experts debated other theories: metallic frame harmonics, engine exhaust interference, atmospheric distortion. They were right about many things, but wrong about one crucial detail. Surface texture mattered. In pursuit of perfection, McKenzie had found simplicity. In Germany, Luftwaffe ground crews were performing similar experiments, coating Junkers, Ju-88 night fighters in matte black paint to reduce visibility in searchlights. But theirs was a visual measure, not a radar one. None suspected that a British mechanic working alone was developing a surface treatment that quietly defied radar itself. By the end of March 1943, McKenzie's experiment was ready for its first real trial. His graphite mixture, refined and filtered through fine mesh cloth, dried faster and bonded tightly to the mosquito's laminated skin. It added only a fraction of a kilogram in weight. He calculated that drag loss would be negligible, less than 2 miles per hour. He recorded his final note that week: surface dull, reflectivity reduced. Recommend operational test. He had no authority to authorize such a mission, but he didn't need it. The war would provide his proof. By the night of March 27, 1943, when Flight Lieutenant Peter Clive prepared for a reconnaissance run over Essen, his Mosquito already carried the secret coating. McKenzie watched from the ground as the engines roared to life, the graphite black skin absorbing the floodlights. To anyone else, it was just another aircraft vanishing into the night. To McKenzie, it was a ghost in the making. By dawn, he would know whether his forbidden mixture could outsmart radar or cost a man his life. The first real test came on the night of March 22, 1943, during a reconnaissance mission over the Ruhr. The operation was routine on paper. Another night flight over Essen, Germany's industrial heart. But to those in the hangars of No. 544 Squadron at RAF Marham, this sortie carried something different, something forbidden. The aircraft assigned Mosquito PR-Die DZ637 looked ordinary in the dim yellow light, yet its dull, shadowed finish concealed the secret work of Sergeant Arthur McKenzie, who had coated its fuselage and leading edges with his graphite-infused varnish. At 22:45 hours, Flight Lieutenant Peter Clive and his navigator, Flying Officer Alan Wright, taxied toward the runway. The airfield was blacked out except for the faint blue glow of signal lamps. As the engines reached full power, the plane's skin absorbed the floodlight instead of reflecting it. To the crews watching, it seemed to melt into the darkness. McKenzie stood by the perimeter fence, hands deep in his pockets, silent. He knew that if the experiment failed, 2 men might not come back, and he would be held responsible. Once airborne, DZ-637 climbed swiftly to 23,000 feet. The Mosquito's twin, Rolls-Royce Merlin. 72 engines hummed steadily, their superchargers whining over the channel. Below, the radar posts of Dunkirk and Calais swept their rotating dishes across the night sky. Normally, the radar operators could track even small mosquitoes for minutes at a time. But that night, something strange appeared on their screens. Or rather, did not. German radar logs later recovered after the war indicated intermittent contacts. A faint return that vanished at low altitude, reappeared briefly, and then faded entirely as the aircraft approached the Ruhr. To the radar crew at Essen, the signal behaved like electrical interference, not an aircraft. The Freya network registered a contact moving at unconfirmed high speed, but the Würzburg D tracking radar failed to lock on. Within seconds, the scope went blank. Meanwhile, inside the Mosquito's cockpit, Clive and Wright flew straight through the predicted flak zones. Nothing fired. No searchlights pierced the clouds. Wright later wrote in his mission notes, "Eerie quiet. No lights, no guns. Felt as though the enemy had gone blind." Over the target area, they descended to 18,000 feet for photography. Clive switched to automatic camera mode, capturing a series of high-altitude shots of the Krupp steelworks and surrounding factories. The Mosquito maintained steady flight for 12 minutes, an eternity in hostile airspace. Yet no searchlight beam touched them. When Clive throttled up for the return climb, the engines strained slightly. He noted a minor reduction in top speed, perhaps 4 miles per hour slower than usual, but the drag loss was trivial compared to the safety they felt. Crossing the Rhine, Wright looked back through the canopy and saw the night sky utterly clear. No tracer fire, no enemy pursuit. The silence unnerved them more than the usual chaos. He turned to Clive and said only, "Max Ghost ship." At 02:10 hours, DZ-637 touched down safely at Marham. Ground crews rushed to meet it, expecting another routine debrief. Instead, they found the crew calm, almost disbelieving. Clive climbed down from the cockpit and pointed toward the fuselage. "Whatever your man did," he told McKenzie, "keep doing it. We didn't see a thing, and they didn't see us." McKenzie said nothing. He walked around the aircraft slowly, running his hand across the matte coating. Under the hangar lights, the surface appeared almost lifeless, absorbing every glimmer. The graphite film had weathered the mission perfectly. No cracks, no peeling, no discoloration. The technical officer arrived minutes later, clipboard in hand. He demanded a full post-flight inspection. When he saw the unapproved coating, his expression hardened. "Who authorized this finish?" he asked sharply. McKenzie hesitated, then answered, "I did, sir." There was a long silence. The officer ordered him to report for questioning the next morning. That night, the mission data was developed and analyzed. The photographic results were extraordinary. The images of Essen's industrial complex were the clearest yet recorded. Sharp, stable, free from the motion blur often caused by evasive maneuvers. Clive's altitude log confirmed uninterrupted flight over radar-controlled territory for nearly 40 minutes. Normally, Mosquitoes encountered searchlights within 10. The intelligence staff compared his route with Luftwaffe air defense records obtained later through signals intercept. The German reports were confused. Unidentified fast aircraft, radar contact intermittent, possible jamming interference. At first, squadron intelligence dismissed the coincidence. Perhaps weather had disrupted radar. Perhaps the Germans were distracted by other bombers. Yet the facts remained. DZ-637 had flown unopposed through one of the most defended regions of Europe. The following morning, McKenzie faced an informal inquiry. The senior maintenance officer, Flight Lieutenant Harold Turner, read aloud the relevant section of the RAF maintenance manual. Unauthorized modification of surface coatings is strictly prohibited. Turner's tone was measured but cold. "You understand, Sergeant, that this could lead to disciplinary action?" McKenzie nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" "Because we were losing them," he replied simply. "And I think I know why." Turner paused. He looked again at the maintenance logs, then at the results from the photo section. The data spoke for itself. DZ-637 had accomplished what no other Mosquito had managed in weeks: a deep reconnaissance run with zero engagement. Turner closed the folder and dismissed McKenzie without a word. That night, the officer quietly sent a memo to Farnborough Technical Branch, marked Preliminary Observation, Unusual Coating Performance. Within days, word spread through the base. Pilots began asking which aircraft was Mac's ghost ship. Mechanics inspected its surface in secret, rubbing their hands along the dull fuselage. Some swore they could feel the difference. Others laughed it off as luck. But luck didn't explain the numbers. The squadron's radar replay equipment confirmed a reduced echo, approximately 15 to 20% lower reflection compared to standard finishes. The readings were crude but consistent. For the first time, the idea of painting invisibility no longer seemed absurd. Crews joked quietly about flying stealth missions, though the term itself did not yet exist. In Germany, Luftwaffe night fighter crews filed confused reports. One pilot of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, stationed near Düsseldorf, noted, "An unidentifiable twin-engine aircraft passed overhead. No visual, no radar lock, only sound." The report reached a Luftnachrichten, air signals, regiment officer, who attributed it to interference from British radar jamming devices. None suspected that the cause was something as primitive as paint. Back at Marham, McKenzie returned to his bench the following morning. The hangar smelled again of oil, lacquer, and cold air. His hands were black with graphite. He had escaped punishment for now. Turner's memo to Farnborough had not yet returned an answer. And until it did, McKenzie's secret remained technically illegal. But as the squadron prepared the next aircraft for service, something had changed in the air. "Respect," one fitter murmured as he passed. "Mac, they're saying your paint made her vanish." McKenzie only shrugged. Then maybe that's what she was built to do. That week, DZ-637 flew 2 more missions over Germany, both without incident. The results were identical: clean photographs, minimal enemy reaction, no radar tracking. Intelligence officers began comparing flight logs with Luftwaffe reports, noting a pattern too precise to ignore. The graphite coating worked. Not perfectly, but enough to confuse the enemy's radar network. McKenzie had risked his career on an unapproved experiment. Instead, he had delivered the first field proof of radar-absorbent coating in combat conditions. The data from those flights would soon find its way to Britain's research laboratories, though his name would not. By dawn, it was clear the field hack had saved lives, but no one dared put it in writing. Word spread fast through the maintenance bays and squadrons. By mid-April 1943, the secret of McKenzie's graphite coating had escaped the walls of RAF Marham. It began with whispers: an aircraft that slipped through the Ruhr without a single searchlight beam, a finish that confused radar, a mechanic who had done something forbidden and somehow survived it. In wartime, rumor moved faster than any official report. Within weeks, crews across Bomber Command were asking one question: what did he paint it with? The answers varied. Some said it was soot. Others said powdered carbon. At least one fitter insisted it was melted pencil lead mixed with varnish. The truth, of course, was simpler and infinitely more dangerous. McKenzie's original mixture, still technically illegal, was being copied by hand in hangars across southern England. The RAF manuals forbade it, but desperation overrode regulation. At RAF Benson and RAF Whiten, 2 key photo reconnaissance bases, mechanics began experimenting with their own Mac mix. Some used boot polish to dull the fuselage glare. Others mixed graphite into standard camouflage paint, producing irregular patches of matte black. The results were inconsistent but measurable. Between April and June 1943, Mosquito losses on reconnaissance missions fell sharply, from 3.8 per thousand sorties to 2.4. Intelligence officers noticed the trend but struggled to explain it. Nothing in official design changes accounted for such an improvement. Unofficial reports from squadrons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force told the same story. Crews flying night operations reported being tracked for shorter periods by German radar and encountering less flak. A technical officer at RAF Benson recorded in his logbook, average radar lock time reduced by approximately 1/4 compared to previous month. Though the term radar lock was not yet formalized, the meaning was clear. Enemy targeting systems were losing them more often. The Luftwaffe noticed too. In late April, technicians of Luftnachrichtenregiment 201, responsible for radar maintenance in the Ruhr, began filing reports of flickering returns and ghost signals. Believing the British had introduced a new electronic countermeasure, they increased their radar power output and adjusted the calibration of their receivers. But the interference persisted. To them, it appeared as though certain British aircraft were literally vanishing from the scope mid-track. The irony was painful. The Germans believed in advanced jamming. The truth was paint. At the squadron level, the effect of the new coding went beyond numbers. It changed behavior. Pilots who had once dreaded night reconnaissance now volunteered for missions. Mechanics competed quietly to refine the mixture, adding small variations of soot, oil, or graphite. McKenzie's formula, 5 parts graphite to 1 part thinner, remained the most effective, but the method was still passed orally, never written. Soon, the dull black coating began appearing on mosquitoes far beyond Marham. Photographs from RAF Benson show aircraft with unpolished fuselages, lacking the distinctive sheen of factory finishes. Officially, they were listed as camouflage adjustments for anti-glare. In truth, they were stealth experiments executed in defiance of regulation. By May 1943, the graphite coating was spreading across Bomber Command, especially among reconnaissance and Pathfinder units. Ground crews referred to these aircraft collectively as ghost flyers. Command headquarters was not blind to the phenomenon. Technical inspectors visiting bases began noting unauthorized surface dulling on aircraft. A memo from Engineering Branch HQ, April 27, 1943, warned, "Refrain from using untested compounds on composite airframes. Damage to lacquer bonding may occur." Yet even as the warning circulated, no disciplinary action followed. The statistical improvements spoke louder than the rules. By early June, the Air Ministry's Directorate of Technical Development ordered a quiet study. Samples of field-applied coatings were collected and sent to Farnborough for evaluation. The resulting internal memo, classified restricted, concluded, "The dull coatings reduce light reflection and possibly radar return. No structural degradation noted." It stopped short of endorsing the practice but did not forbid it either. In wartime bureaucracy, silence often meant permission. The Luftwaffe, unaware of these subtle changes, continued to escalate countermeasures. Radar stations along the coast increased their transmitter power and recalibrated their Würzburg B sets for greater sensitivity. Operators noted a new category of targets, ghost signals, that appeared briefly then faded. Too strong to be noise, but too weak to track. Analysts concluded that British bombers were testing active jamming or using radar-absorbent nets. The idea that a thin carbon film could cause such confusion never occurred to them. In May, the Reich Air Defense Command issued a directive to all radar stations. Report any unidentified targets of unstable return. Suspected interference by enemy transmitters. What they were really seeing were graphite-coated mosquitoes. On the British side, the data accumulated. The Operational Research Section, ORS, compiled loss figures and radar engagement times. The findings were striking. Average radar detection range against mosquitoes before modification, 9.2 kilometers. After coating, reduced to 8.2 or less, a cut of 1,000 meters on average. Night fighter intercept rate dropped by nearly 30% across reconnaissance units. For the first time since the winter of 1942, crews began believing the Mosquito was once again living up to its reputation as the aircraft that Germany could not catch. Within the hangars, the change in atmosphere was tangible. Where once there had been despair and mechanical fatigue, there was now quiet pride. Mechanics wiped their graphite-stained hands on rags, nodding at aircraft that gleamed less and survived more. When new recruits asked what the mixture was called, the veterans just smiled. "It's Max Mix. That's all you need to know." McKenzie himself remained stationed at Marham, still officially a line mechanic. He never claimed ownership of the spreading innovation. He simply refined the formula, replacing coarse graphite with finer signal-grade carbon to achieve smoother application and lighter weight. He kept his notes hidden in a tin toolbox beneath his bench. Though he received no formal credit, his work was everywhere. On wings streaked dull gray, on fuselages that swallowed light, on aircraft that came home when they shouldn't have. By the end of June, the statistical shift could no longer be ignored. Reconnaissance mission completion rates had increased by nearly 20%. Loss rates per 1,000 sorties had reached their lowest point in a year. Senior officers began quietly authorizing the dull coating under the euphemism anti-glare finish, field approved. It was the official label for an unofficial miracle. The RAF had stumbled, through one man's defiance, into the early age of stealth. What began as a forbidden act of maintenance had turned into an underground engineering movement, unrecorded, unacknowledged but undeniable in effect. Across Britain's airfields, in hangars filled with graphite dust and acetone fumes, the Mosquito was being reborn as something new, a ghost made of wood and carbon. By July 1943, the quiet modification had turned into an open secret, one even high command couldn't ignore. Eventually, proof arrived not in theory, but in numbers. By the autumn of 1943, the pattern was undeniable. Mosquito losses had fallen across every front where the aircraft flew. Crews reported easier passage through enemy radar zones, cleaner reconnaissance runs, and fewer night fighter interceptions. At first, the results were attributed to better tactics or weather conditions. But the data didn't lie. The aircraft with dull, darkened surfaces, especially those treated with graphite mixtures, were surviving in statistically significant numbers. In September, the Air Ministry's Operational Research Section compiled a comparative analysis of sortie losses. Out of nearly 3,000 reconnaissance missions flown between April and August, only 56 aircraft had been lost to enemy action. The rate, under 2%, was the lowest since the Mosquito entered service. The report's appendix contained a single handwritten note from an analyst at Farnborough. Field-applied matte coatings correlate with reduced radar interception probability. It was enough to trigger a formal investigation. The Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, at Malvern, the nerve center of British radar science, received the field data in October 1943. Engineers there were intrigued but skeptical. Radar-absorbent material was a concept they considered theoretical. No field unit had ever demonstrated measurable effect. Still, they authorized a series of laboratory trials under the codename Project Dullskin. Technicians constructed mock panels from mosquito-grade plywood, coated half with standard high-gloss dope, and the other half with various carbon mixtures sourced from RAF stations. Among the samples was one tin of McKenzie's original graphite compound, collected anonymously and labeled Marhem Formula. When tested under simulated Würzburg D radar frequencies between 50 and 60 centimeters wavelength, the results stunned the researchers. The unmodified surface reflected nearly 75% of incident energy, while the graphite-treated panel reflected less than 50%. The difference, though modest in civilian terms, represented a 33% reduction in radar cross-section, enough to cause intermittent contact on enemy scopes. A technical memorandum issued soon after, TRE Memo 12-43, summarized it plainly. Carbon-based coatings show consistent signal attenuation. Application on aircraft surfaces may reduce radar detection range without adverse structural effect. It was the First time a government laboratory had acknowledged radar absorption as a measurable property, and it came directly from the unauthorized work of a mechanic who had broken every rule to prove it. Parallel tests at Farnborough's Aeronautical Research Establishment confirmed the findings. Using an experimental Type 271 radar set, engineers measured the radar signature of a full-scale mosquito nose section treated with graphite varnish. Their conclusion was clear. The coating reduced reflective return equivalent to shrinking the aircraft's radar cross-section by nearly 1/5. In practical terms, a radar that once detected a mosquito at 10 kilometers would now lose it at 8 kilometers or less. The effect could not make the aircraft invisible, but it gave pilots precious seconds, enough to cross a flak belt before guns could adjust. For the crews who lived on those seconds, it was everything. At the same time, German intelligence began noticing the consequences. Captured fragments of Luftwaffe communications from Luftnachrichten Regiment 201 revealed growing confusion among radar operators. One translated report dated November 2, 1943, read, "Certain British aircraft now vanish from scopes at low altitude. Assumed use of new electromagnetic countermeasures. Ghost jammer. Recommend increase of transmitter gain and antenna calibration." The Germans believed the British had introduced advanced jamming transmitters. They never suspected the cause was chemical, not electronic. The irony deepened. McKenzie's crude hangar mixture was now being blamed for a phantom technology the Allies didn't yet possess. As the evidence accumulated, the Air Ministry quietly authorized field standardization. The directive avoided mentioning radar entirely. Instead, it described the new coating as an anti-glare finish for composite surfaces, approved for limited operational use. Within weeks, supply depots received shipments of pre-mixed graphite dope derived from McKenzie's formula. It was applied first to photo reconnaissance and Pathfinder aircraft, and later to selected night fighter variants of the Mosquito. Among the units selected for expanded trials was 618 Squadron, a secretive detachment trained for precision strikes against naval targets. Their Mosquitoes, prepared for anti-ship operations in Norway, received full graphite coating along the fuselage and leading edges. Crew reports from these missions noted reduced detection by both radar-guided flak and shipborne fire control systems. The improvement allowed low-level attack runs that would have been suicidal months earlier. By December 1943, the data from TRE and Farnborough converged into an official recommendation. Continue the application of carbon-based coatings where feasible. The report noted, standard lacquer reflectivity averages 0.75 under 560 MHz testing. Graphite augmented dope registers between 0.45 and 0.50. Operational results confirm reduction in enemy radar acquisition and engagement. The phrase enemy radar acquisition was deliberately vague, but every engineer at TRE understood its meaning. Britain had stumbled upon stealth. To the men in the field, the validation changed little. They had already believed in the results for months. But for McKenzie, it meant something deeper, proof that his risk, his defiance, had mattered. In January 1944, McKenzie was summoned to Farnborough under the pretext of a technical consultation. He arrived in uniform, nervous and expecting disciplinary action. Instead, he was escorted to a small laboratory where engineers had pinned sheets of radar test data across the walls. One scientist, a bespectacled civilian named Dr. Arnold Wilkins, greeted him politely and said, "You're the man from Marham, aren't you?" McKenzie hesitated. "Yes, sir. I suppose I am." Wilkins smiled faintly. "You realize you've just given us a year's head start on a problem we didn't know how to solve?" The meeting lasted less than an hour. McKenzie demonstrated how he had mixed and applied the coating, describing ratios, drying temperatures, and surface thickness. The scientists took meticulous notes, but offered little comment. When he left, he was handed a single-typed acknowledgement letter thanking him for his technical initiative contributing to the improvement of operational aircraft survivability. It was not a medal, but it was survival of another kind. Behind the scenes, His superior officer, Flight Lieutenant Harold Turner, was promoted and later credited in official correspondence for the development of radar reflectivity mitigation coatings. McKenzie's name appeared nowhere. Such was the nature of wartime bureaucracy. Innovation was collective, and the lone mechanic's defiance was rewritten as institutional success. Still, the evidence spoke for itself. By the end of 1943, mosquito loss rates across Bomber Command had dropped below 2%, and deep penetration reconnaissance missions reached as far as Berlin with minimal detection. German reports from the period lamented the disappearance of mosquitoes from radar screens, calling them Geisterflugzeuge, ghost aircraft. The ghost, once born in a cold Norfolk hangar, now haunted the entire Reich. For McKenzie, life returned to routine. He continued his maintenance duties, still working long nights under the echoing drone of Merlin engines. Few outside his squadron knew what he had achieved. To his peers, he was simply Mac, the quiet Scot who never stopped tinkering. But history had already recorded the shift. A mechanic's intuition had produced the world's first practical radar-absorbent material, long before stealth became a doctrine. Before black budgets and classified projects, one unauthorized mixture of graphite and dope had rewritten the relationship between aircraft and radar. In February 1944, a confidential note circulated within the Air Ministry. Further research into low reflectivity coatings recommended for future composite and metal aircraft. Potential applications extend beyond current operations. The seed had been planted, and it would grow into the heart of Cold War technology. McKenzie received no medal, no public credit, and no promotion. But his name appeared quietly in an internal commendation list at RAF Technical Command. A single line: Sergeant A. McKenzie, commended for technical initiative. He folded the paper, placed it in his locker, and returned to work. By the war's end, even enemy engineers quietly admitted what the data had long proved. The mosquito had become the first ghost of modern warfare. In the years that followed, the story of Sergeant Arthur McKenzie nearly vanished into classified archives. When the war ended in 1945, Britain's focus shifted from survival to reconstruction. Factories demobilized, hangars emptied, and the paper trails of wartime improvisation were quietly boxed away or burned. To the bureaucrats who managed military records, McKenzie was simply another aircraft mechanic, a name among thousands of men who kept the war machine turning. The graphite-coated mosquitoes were stripped, repainted, and returned to peacetime duty. Their secret died beneath new layers of standard finish. Yet unknown to anyone at the time, McKenzie's idea had already begun echoing far beyond the hangars of Norfolk. In the late 1940s, British and American radar researchers continued exploring low reflectivity materials. Documents from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, Farnborough mention carbon-loaded lacquers tested for radio interference reduction, an unmistakable descendant of McKenzie's field experiments. Across the Atlantic, engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works and the U.S. Air Force were studying similar concepts. Their goal was not camouflage, but invisibility, aircraft that radar could barely see. By the 1950s, the Cold War had transformed radar from a defensive tool into a global surveillance network. The Americans developed a coating known as iron ball, a mixture of carbonyl iron and epoxy resin designed to absorb radar waves by converting them into heat. The same principle, energy absorption through conductive particles, was identical to what McKenzie had done with graphite. 30 years earlier, when the Lockheed U-2 spy plane entered service in 1956, engineers applied experimental radar dulling paint derived from these early studies. 2 decades later, its successor, the SR-71 Blackbird, would rely on a refined version of the same concept. A black, carbon-based coating that dissipated radar energy while enduring extreme temperatures at Mach 3. The parallel was undeniable. McKenzie's crude wartime mixture made from workshop graphite and aircraft dope had anticipated the foundation of stealth technology. While aerospace science advanced, McKenzie's name faded into obscurity. After the war, he left the Royal Air Force and emigrated to Canada, taking work at a small paint manufacturing company in Ontario. Colleagues described him as quiet and meticulous, a man who preferred formulae to conversation. He never spoke of his wartime work. To those who asked, he said only, "I kept planes flying." He died in 1978, unrecognized and unaware that his idea had shaped the future of aviation. The rediscovery came decades later. In 1999, a team of RAF historians reviewing maintenance archives at RAF Marham stumbled upon several unusual logbook entries from 1943. Among them was a reference to non-standard carbon finish applied to aircraft DZ-637 for trial purposes. Attached was a faint signature, A. McKenzie, Sergeant Airframe Section, cross-referencing the entry with declassified correspondence from the telecommunications research establishment confirmed the connection. Further, evidence emerged from a misfiled folder at Farnborough's Historical Archives containing one tin label marked Graphite Compound, Marham Formula. Laboratory. Notes identified the mixture's composition as 60% carbon powder and cellulose lacquer. Chemically, identical to modern radar absorbent coatings. Aviation historian John Sweetman, writing in 2002, summarized the revelation. His graphite varnish was the ancestor of stealth paint, a field innovation born not from design bureaus, but from the smell of acetone and fear. The realization reframed part of wartime innovation history. For decades, historians credited radar scientists like Sir Robert Watson Watt and engineers at Malvern for advancing radar defense. But McKenzie's contribution illustrated a different kind of progress, one that came from below, through improvisation and defiance rather than institutional planning. His experiment bridged craftsmanship and physics, intuition and survival. Modern engineers studying stealth materials often reference top-down research, government-funded programs with laboratories, equations, and models. McKenzie represented the opposite. Bottom-up innovation. A single mechanic, working with scrap and experience, achieved what committees only theorized. His legacy is not the technology itself, but the mindset. That creativity under constraint is as potent as any formal research grant. The influence of his discovery endured quietly within British aviation. In the 1960s, the RAF Paint Chemistry Division introduced radar-scattering microcoatings for aircraft operating near Soviet airspace. Though officially credited to new research, their spectral properties matched those of graphite-based compounds tested during the war. The concept of reducing radar visibility through material science had become standard doctrine. Today, every stealth aircraft, from the F-117 Nighthawk to the B-2 Spirit, owes its heritage to a principle first proven on a mosquito's wooden skin. That radar energy could be defeated not only by shape, but by surface. McKenzie's story, once nearly erased, has since become a case study in creative defiance. In 2005, a small plaque was installed at RAF Marham's museum workshop. In recognition of Sergeant Arthur Mac McKenzie, 1916 to 1978, whose unauthorized modification to the Mosquito PR die contributed to the advancement of radar-absorbent technology. Visitors rarely notice it among the displays of engines and propellers, but its message lingers. It stands for every forgotten craftsman whose courage lived not in battle, but in the quiet persistence to think differently. War often rewards obedience, but it survives on defiance. McKenzie's life reminds us that progress rarely comes from orders. It comes from those willing to question them. His graphite-stained hands built a shadow that would stretch into the jet age and beyond. War rewards survival, but it's the quiet thinkers who keep it possible.